The heavy oak doors echoed with a desperate knock at the height of a relentless midnight downpour. The estate's security cameras captured something no one could believe. Standing there wasn't a tactical strike team, wasn't a rival syndicate looking for blood. It was a 7-year-old girl with soaked blonde hair and a bright yellow dress, sobbing uncontrollably. In her arms, she cradled a fragile newborn sister wrapped tightly in a matching yellow blanket. She had navigated the violent storm to collapse against the most terrifying threshold in the city, the estate of underworld boss Grant Torino. "Please, hide my sister," her voice broke through the thunder. "He's going to kill her tonight." A dozen hardened enforcers in the foyer turned to stone. No one breathed. No one moved. Then Grant Torino, the man who made the city's criminal elite beau, pushed open the glass-paned doors. Stepping into the freezing rain in his immaculate suit, he gently placed a tattooed hand on the newborn's head, looked down at the weeping girl, and said 2 words. 2 words that started a war. "Come inside." 10 minutes earlier, the private sanctum inside the Torino estate glowed with a tense, low light. A sprawling mahogany table sat in the center of the room, having served as the silent witness to decades of syndicate rulings. Crystal decanters sat half empty. Heavy smoke drifted toward the vaulted ceiling, filling the kind of room where empires were forged and enemies were erased. At the head of the table sat Grant Torino. His dark hair was slicked back sharply from a face that mirrored the ruthless, cold authority of a Roman emperor. Intricate, dark tattoos crept up above his crisp white collar, trailing up his neck and dusting his jawline, ink that marked a brutal history no one dared to ask about. No one ever would. He didn't need to raise his voice to command absolute attention. He simply existed, and the room bent around him. When Grant Torino listened, everyone else stopped talking. When he spoke, everyone else stopped breathing. Tonight he listened. The international adoption rings are getting bold. Bruno's voice rumbled like grinding stones. He sat to Grant's right. 6'5", a mountain of brutal force with knuckles permanently scarred from underground rings, wrapped in a dark suit stretching at the seams. A former heavyweight enforcer who had seen violence in places polite society pretended didn't exist. He spoke rarely. When he did, blood usually followed. "They're moving undocumented cargo through the northern docks," Bruno continued. 3 shipments this week. They're testing our borders." Victor leaned forward into the light. The syndicate's legal ghost, a Yale-educated mastermind who had traded a corporate corner office for the shadows. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and maintained dead-calm eyes, the kind of man who could launder millions or orchestrate a disappearance with the exact same smooth, steady hand. "We should issue a quiet warning," Victor suggested smoothly. "These brokers are greedy, but they aren't completely stupid. They know the cost of dragging federal eyes into our territory." The heavy oak doors sealed shut with a deafening thud, cutting off the howl of the Chicago storm. Inside the grand foyer of the Torino estate, the silence was heavier than the thunder outside. A dozen hardened criminals, men who had seen everything this ugly world had to offer, turned to stare. They looked at this tiny, shivering 7-year-old girl in a drenched yellow dress like she was something from another planet. Puddles of rainwater formed around her bare, trembling feet on the imported marble floor. Grant Torino stepped fully into the ambient light of the chandelier. He was a man whose very name made police commissioners nervous, and whose enemies had a habit of disappearing without a trace. His dark hair was slicked back sharply from a face that mirrored the ruthless, cold authority of a Roman emperor. Intricate, dark ink crept up above his crisp white collar, trailing up his neck and dusting his jawline, tattoos that marked a brutal history of violence he had spent decades mastering. Crime lords twice her age couldn't meet his steely gaze without flinching. Yet, as Grant moved slowly toward her, his imposing frame casting a long shadow, Arya didn't look away. He saw it immediately in her wide, tear-filled eyes. It wasn't bravery, nor was it recklessness. It was the profound, shattering desperation of a child who had tried every other avenue, only to learn that the people who were supposed to protect her had become the very monsters she was running from. Grant knelt smoothly, the expensive fabric of his tailored suit pulling taut, lowering himself until his eyes were completely level with hers. He didn't tower over her. Up close, He could hear the frantic, shallow breaths of the newborn sister wrapped tightly in the yellow blanket. The infant was completely silent, a stillness that was somehow more terrifying than any scream could ever be. The baby's tiny fist clutched the collar of Aria's dress, holding on even in unconsciousness, knowing instinctively that this soaking wet 7-year-old girl was her only safety. "He's going to kill her tonight," Aria whispered, her small body trembling violently from the frigid air, exhaustion, and sheer terror. But she wasn't begging. She was stating a horrifying fact, bracing herself for yet another door to be slammed in her face. Grant's jaw tightened. "Who?" he asked, his voice softer than anyone in that grand, terrifying room had ever heard it. "My uncle," Aria choked out, a fresh tear cutting through the rainwater on her cheek. "He says we're property. He said she's special cargo." If you can't stand people who treat the innocent like property, hit subscribe and comment. I stand for justice, to show you're not siding with the villains. As Aria swallowed a sob, the neckline of her soaked yellow dress shifted, revealing a delicate, tarnished silver chain resting against her pale collarbone. Suspended from the chain was a small pendant shaped like a sunburst, missing exactly one ray on the left side. For one heartbeat, the opulent foyer, the armed enforcers, and the raging storm outside completely disappeared. Grant stopped breathing. The air in his lungs turned to glass. 22 years ago, a different girl, the exact same age, had stood trembling in a dark hallway, desperately needing someone to save her. His little sister, Clara. They had hidden together while a monster, their own father, tore their house apart in a drunken rage. Clara had worn that exact same imperfect sunburst pendant, a cheap trinket from a street fair that she guarded like crown jewels. Grant had been just a boy, small and powerless. He had thrown himself at the monster to protect her, punching, kicking, and biting with everything he had against a grown man. It hadn't been enough. The last thing Grant remembered from that night was the crack of a fist against his jaw, his own skull hitting the floor, and waking up to find Clara gone. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, but the feeling remained, a jagged knife twisting viciously in a wound that had never fully healed. Grant had spent the last 2 decades building an empire of blood and shadow, driven by the cold, punishing belief that wanting to protect someone wasn't enough, that love without power was utterly useless. He had amassed enough power to bend the entire city to his will, but all the wealth and violence in the world had never brought his sister back. He stared at the sunburst pendant resting against Aria's shivering skin. The universe was offering him an impossible echo, a second chance masked in the pouring rain. The man who ruled the city's dark underbelly looked at the girl who had walked miles through a tempest to knock on the devil's door. Grant reached out, his heavily tattooed hand moving with deliberate, impossible tenderness, and gently brushed the wet blonde hair away from Aria's forehead. His thumb grazed the edge of the silver chain. "You're staying," Grant said, his voice a low, absolute vow. "Both of you." Aria blinked, her breath catching. She looked at this terrifying stranger, this monster the world feared, and saw something she hadn't seen since she was placed in her uncle's twisted care. Someone who actually meant it. "Nobody is going to hurt you ever again," Grant commanded, the icy calculation that built his empire dissolving into a fierce, unwavering protectiveness. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "I promise." Grant stood up, his towering frame suddenly radiating a terrifying, focused urgency. The Roman emperor was gone, the warlord had awakened. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply turned his head toward the shadows where his men waited in stunned silence. "Bruno, Victor!" Grant's voice cut through the lingering echoes of the storm, final and absolute, beneath the ice of his tone. There was a lethal urgency, the kind that made dangerous men move without asking questions. The men exploded into action. Bruno, the mountain of scars and muscle, moved faster than seemed physically possible, disappearing down the marble hallway. He returned seconds later with an armful of thick, expensive Egyptian cotton towels, the softest the house had to offer. Victor, the Yale-educated legal mastermind, was already at the wall panels, cranking the mansion's thermostat to its absolute maximum. The massive stone fireplace roared to life. golden flames dancing violently behind the ornate iron grate, beginning to push back the bone-chilling cold of the storm. Grant remained perfectly still, standing like an impenetrable shield between the front doors and the shivering little girl in the yellow dress. He watched as Bruno cautiously approached, a giant towering over her, and then lowered himself, kneeling until his eyes were level with hers so he wouldn't frighten the child, before carefully wrapping a massive towel around Arya and the baby. The underworld boss touched the edge of the dark ink creeping up his own neck. He had failed 22 years ago because he was weak. Tonight, he was the most dangerous man in the city. The corrupt uncle, the human brokers, the bought-and paid-for detectives, they had no idea what kind of hell they had just invited upon themselves. Grant Torino swore it on the silver sunburst pendant. Arya and her sister would never be alone again. The command had been given, and the temperature of the room shifted immediately. Grant Torino, a man whose sharply tailored suits and intricate neck tattoos usually signaled the violent end of someone's life, had just decreed that these two fragile lives were now under his absolute protection. 12 hardened men, enforcers, fixers, and killers who had seen the absolute worst of the Chicago underworld, exploded into a coordinated, frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with survival. Bruno, the 6'5" mountain of muscle and scarred knuckles, disappeared down the grand marble hallway. He moved with a terrifying, silent speed for a man of his immense size, returning 30 seconds later with a towering stack of thick, heated Egyptian cotton towels. Victor, the Yale-educated legal mastermind with his wire-rimmed glasses and dead-calm eyes, had already overridden the estate's climate control, pushing the thermostats to their absolute maximum. The cavernous foyer, a space usually echoing with the cold calculations of syndicate business, began to swelter with a desperate, life-saving heat. Across the room, Leo, a 40-year-old capo who had broken arms without blinking, stood in the sprawling industrial kitchen staring at a high-end stove in utter panic. He held his sleek smartphone tightly to his ear, his voice strained. "Just tell me how to heat the milk, Maria," he barked into the receiver, packing the slate floor. "I don't know, she's a newborn. How do I test it?" The inside of the wrist. He listened intently to his wife's confused, sleep-heavy voice, nodded rapidly at the empty air, and hung up, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for a stainless steel saucepan. There were no children in the Torino estate. There hadn't been for 22 years. Back in the foyer, Bruno approached Arya. The 7-year-old girl stood barefoot on the marble, trembling violently in her soaked yellow dress. Bruno towered over her, 3 times her height and 4 times her weight, casting a shadow that could swallow her whole. Then, the heavyweight enforcer did something his men had never witnessed. He dropped heavily to his knees, ignoring the sharp ache in his joints, lowering his massive frame until he was looking up at the terrified blonde girl instead of down. "Can I hold her?" Bruno's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, miraculously softened to a near whisper. "Just to get her warm. I swear on my life I'll be gentle." Arya stared at him. For 10 agonizing seconds, her wide, bloodshot eyes calculated the risk, measuring this giant with his bruised knuckles to decide if he could be trusted with the only thing in the universe she had left to love. Slowly, her small, trembling arms extended. Bruno took the newborn like he was handling spun glass. His massive hands that had shattered bone and ended lives, cradled the tiny infant in her yellow blanket with an impossible, breathtaking tenderness. The newborn stirred. Her freezing body curled instinctively into the immense, radiating heat of Bruno's chest. A tiny sigh escaped the baby's pale lips, and her microscopic fist reached out, clamping weakly but stubbornly onto the lapel of Bruno's dark suit. Something fundamental cracked in Bruno's weathered face. The impenetrable hardness melted away entirely, leaving a fierce, raw devotion in its wake. Leo rushed in from the kitchen, holding a sterilized dropper and a small glass of perfectly warmed milk. "Tested it on the wrist, just like Maria said," he announced, entirely out of breath. Bruno tilted the infant slightly, allowing Leo to carefully administer the drops. The soft, desperate sounds of the newborn feeding filled the silent room, louder and more profound than the raging Chicago storm outside. Victor approached quietly, setting a silver tray on a low mahogany table in front of Arya. It held warm bread, scrambled eggs, and a glass of juice, the best the estate's private chef could assemble at midnight. Arya stared at the tray, her eyes widening as if looking at a chest of gold, but she didn't move her hands. Grant crouched beside her, his sharp Roman features softening in the amber light. The dark ink creeping up his neck shifted as he tilted his head. "When was the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning," Arya whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fireplace. "Then eat," Grant urged gently. Arya shook her head, her wet blonde hair sticking to her pale cheeks. Her eyes darted back to Bruno and the baby. "Her first, please make sure she's full." The room went entirely still. A dozen dangerous men stared at this starving, freezing 7-year-old child who had dragged herself through a tempest, who had every right to think only of her own survival. And yet, her only thought, her only priority was her sister. Leo turned his face away, his jaw tight. Victor pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose, swallowing hard. Grant felt that old, familiar ghost brush past him, the memory of Clara, and the devastating realization of what happens when innocent people are treated as nothing more than leverage and cargo by the monsters of the world. If you can't stand people who treat the innocent like property, hit subscribe and comment. I stand for justice, to show you're not siding with the villains. "She's eating," Grant said softly, gesturing to Bruno, who was watching the baby feed with rapt, unblinking attention. "She's safe. Now it's your turn." Only then did Arya reach for the bread. She ate quickly, silently, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected someone to snatch the tray away at any moment. She had learned early that good things were temporary, that people like her uncle only saw children as commodities to be traded in the dark. Grant watched her eat, a cold, lethal fury locking into place within his chest. He had negotiated with cartels and warred with rival syndicates, but he had never met anyone with the sheer, unadulterated courage of the little girl in the yellow dress. By 3 a.m, the heavy storm had settled into a steady, freezing rain. Arya and her sister were finally asleep in a secure, plush guest suite on the second floor, wrapped in dry clothes and thick blankets. Outside their heavy wooden door, Bruno pulled up a wingback chair. He sat down, his massive frame settling in like a boulder, finding its natural resting place on the edge of a cliff. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, his eyes locked straight ahead down the dimly lit corridor. Victor walked past, a stack of encrypted tablets in his hand as he prepared to trace the uncle's illicit financial ties and dismantle his life piece by piece. He paused, looking down at the giant enforcer. "You should get some sleep, Bruno. I can have 2 men take the watch." "I'm not moving," Bruno replied, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "Nobody gets within 100 feet of this door." Victor nodded once, understanding completely. The men of the Torino syndicate had spent their lives dealing in violence, power, and fear. But tonight they had found a new religion. Downstairs, Grant Torino stood by the grand windows, watching the rain wash the city streets clean. He thought of the silver sunburst pendant resting against Arya's collarbone, the mirror of his greatest failure. He would not fail again. His resolve had turned to absolute granite. The men in black suits were no longer just a mafia syndicate. They were a fortress. And heaven help the man who tried to breach it. At 8 a.m, the heavy mahogany dining table had transformed into a war room. Victor walked in looking like death, his tie discarded, and the sleeves of his expensive tailored shirt rolled up to his elbows. He hadn't slept a single minute since the little girl in the yellow dress had knocked on their doors. His pale face was tight with a grim, focused exhaustion as he dropped a thick, encrypted tablet and a leather-bound folder in front of Grant Torino. Grant sat at the head of the table, his dark Roman features carved from stone, his neck tattoos standing out starkly against his crisp white collar. He hadn't slept either. "The uncle isn't just an abusive degenerate," Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp pitch. "He's connected." Grant opened the folder. Inside were high-resolution surveillance photographs, offshore bank statements, and transcripts of intercepted digital communications. Victor had spent the darkest hours of the night tearing through the uncle's digital footprint. He slid a printed photograph across the polished wood, a mugshot of the uncle, a man with hollowed cheeks, dead eyes, and a cruel smirk. On paper, he looked like a common street-level grifter with a history of dismissed assault charges and petty theft. But Victor's relentless digging had unearthed the rotting foundation beneath the surface. He works for an international adoption ring, Victor explained, tapping the glass screen of the tablet. Human trafficking, specifically infants and young children. Bruno, who had just stepped into the room after being relieved of his post outside the girl's door, froze. The massive enforcer's hands curled into fists so tight his scarred knuckles turned bone-white. "What?" the giant rumbled, the word sounding like a deadly threat. Victor didn't flinch, though his dead calm eyes darkened. "The man the uncle reports to is known as the broker," Victor continued, pulling up a secondary file. "He runs a massive shadow network moving undocumented cargo through the northern docks and overseas. They specialize in children." Grant's jaw locked. The temperature in the room plummeted. The Torino syndicate had crossed paths with ruthless men before, engaging in bloody territorial disputes and cartel warfare. But there were unwritten laws in the underworld, and this crossed every single one of them. "What is the uncle's connection to this network?" Grant asked, his voice a lethal whisper. "Gambling and narcotic debts," Victor answered flatly. He pulled up a ledger, lines of red numbers glaring back at them. "He owes the broker upward of $250,000, money a low-level grifter like him will never see in his lifetime." The room went entirely silent. The implication hung in the air, sickening and heavy. "So he's paying it back another way," Grant concluded, the silver sunburst pendant he had sworn to protect flashing in his mind's eye. Victor nodded grimly. He was going to sell his own newborn niece to clear his ledger. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Bruno's face turned a dark, violent shade of red, a thick vein pulsing dangerously at his temple. The giant enforcer looked as though he was ready to tear the city apart with his bare hands. "The baby was the special cargo Aria heard him talking about," Victor continued, his voice tight. "The uncle was using his legal guardianship as a cover. The newborn was slated to be shipped out by Friday night, and Aria is 7. She talks. She saw the holding locations. She knew too much. He was going to kill the older sister to cover his tracks and sell the infant," Grant said, articulating the absolute evil of the plan. Victor removed his wire-rimmed glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "It gets worse. I checked the local precinct's response logs. The reason the uncle hasn't been arrested despite multiple noise complaints and suspected abuse reports is because he has a shield." Victor tossed a final file onto the mahogany table. "Detective Ray Hoffman, a decorated precinct captain, 20 years on the force." Grant studied the photo of the smiling detective in his dress uniform. "Hoffman takes monthly payments from the broker," Victor explained, his tone dripping with absolute disgust. "He's been clearing the uncle's records and burying investigations for years. Hoffman is the wall between this trafficking ring and the law. If we just hand the kids over to child services, Hoffman will intercept them, and they'll be back in the uncle's hands by midnight." The gravity of the situation settled over the war room. This wasn't just a matter of hiding 2 terrified children from a drunken relative. This was a sprawling, systemic cancer. They were up against a massive trafficking network, protected by a corrupt legal system that was supposed to shield the innocent, but instead sold them to the highest bidder. Bruno slammed his massive palm against the wall, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "They sell children," the giant roared, his voice cracking with a terrifying, untethered rage. "I don't care about their network. I don't care how many detectives they own. Those girls came to us. We burn it all down." Grant Torino slowly stood up. The tattoos on his neck seemed to shift as his posture straightened, radiating a cold, calculated menace that dwarfed even Bruno's explosive anger. He looked at the files, then up at the ceiling, toward the second floor where Aria and the baby were currently sleeping under armed guard. "We don't just burn it down, Bruno," Grant said, his gray eyes turning to absolute steel. "We do it smart, we do it thorough." He placed both hands firmly on the mahogany table, leaning forward. "First, nobody gets near that room upstairs. That is priority 1. Second, Victor, build an airtight case. Compile every bank record, every text message, every photograph. Find me a judge who hasn't been bought." Grant turned toward the window, looking out at the gray Chicago skyline. The storm from the previous night had passed, but a much darker one was brewing. "And third," Grant commanded, his voice devoid of mercy, "we call in the alliance. This is too big for a local hit. We bring in every family that shares our principles. We make sure this uncle and his broker never draw breath to hurt another child again." That evening, Grant Torino sat alone in the shadows of his sprawling study, the glowing screen of his encrypted phone casting a harsh light over his tattooed jawline. He was about to initiate a sequence of events that would irrevocably alter the criminal landscape of the country. He made 4 phone calls. Each one lasted less than 5 minutes. There was no small talk, no pleasantries, just straight to the brutal point. The first call went to New York. Salvatore Colombo, the 65-year-old head of the oldest syndicate on the East Coast, answered with a gravelly hum. He was a man whose mere word was considered absolute law across 5 boroughs. "Human trafficking," Salvatore's voice crackled through the encrypted line. "In Chicago, children." "They're selling children, Salvatore," Grant said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "An uncle paying off a gambling debt to the broker's network, a 7-year-old girl and an infant." A long, heavy pause hung over the line. "Torino, you know exactly where we stand on this," Salvatore finally said, his tone turning into cold iron. "Children are the line nobody crosses." "I know," Grant replied softly. "I'm sending 12 of my best enforcers," Salvatore stated. "They'll be in your city by tomorrow morning." Grant ended the call and dialed a Boston area code. The second call went to Vincenzo Russo, a 58-year-old titan who had built an empire from nothing, controlling everything from the industrial docks to the underground transport routes. "The broker," Vincenzo spat the name through the receiver like poison. "That bastard tried to move product through my territory last year, killed 2 of my men when I pushed back. You're telling me he's running a trafficking ring? With children?" "Yes," Grant confirmed, "and the local precinct is covering it up." "This is the opportunity I've been waiting for to settle the score," Vincenzo growled. "I'll be there myself, with 10 men. We end this together." The third call went to the sun-drenched coast of Miami. Angelo Marcillo, a boss who ran the southern shores with an iron fist hidden meticulously behind a velvet glove, listened in absolute silence. "Let me understand this perfectly, Grant," Angelo murmured. "A 7-year-old girl walked through a hurricane to knock on your door." "A severe storm," Grant corrected, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling where Aria slept. "But yes." Angelo was quiet for a deeply contemplative moment. "If we don't protect children, what are we?" the Miami boss asked rhetorically. "What separates us from the animals?" "Nothing," Grant answered. "Exactly," Angelo's voice hardened into steel. "I'll be there in 24 hours, 15 men, whatever you need, my friend." Villains thrive when good people do nothing. Hit that like button if you believe the greedy should never win over the vulnerable. Grant tapped his screen one final time. The fourth call went to Detroit. Vito Romano was the youngest syndicate head in the country, a man known to be hungry and ambitious, but bound by a strict, old-world code of honor. "The broker approached me 6 months ago," Vito said, the realization dawning darkly in his tone. "He wanted to use my northern routes for his shipments. I asked what kind of shipments, and he told me it was special cargo. I told him to go to hell." Grant heard the sound of glass shattering over the line, as if Vito had just crushed a heavy tumbler in his bare hand. "Now I know exactly what special cargo meant," Vito's voice turned freezing cold. "Count me in, 10 men. We burn his entire operation to the ground." Grant hung up the phone and set it onto his sprawling mahogany desk. Across the dimly lit room, Victor stood leaning against a bookshelf, watching the Chicago warlord with wide, calculating eyes. The Yale-educated mastermind was still trying to process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what had just occurred. "You're wondering why they all said yes so quickly," Grant said, reading the silent question on Victor's face. Why they are sending armies and resources for two kids they've never met. Victor nodded slowly. We deal in shadows, Grant. We move money, we bypass laws, we handle problems in ways that would lock us in federal prison for life. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. This kind of exposure, it defies all of our logic. Grant stood up, the intricate ink on his neck catching the amber light. We are not saints, Victor, but there are limits. Unwritten rules that every single one of us follows. Rules that make us fundamentally different from common monsters. Bruno, having stepped silently into the doorway of the study, crossed his massive, scarred arms. Women who aren't in the life, the giant enforcer rumbled, finishing the thought. And children always. Anyone who crosses those lines loses their protection, loses all respect, and immediately becomes a target. Bruno's massive fists clenched at his sides, remembering the fragile weight of the newborn in his arms. That's exactly why we hate traffickers. They possess absolutely no honor and no limits. They sell human beings like cattle. The enforcer's jaw tightened until the muscles threatened to snap. They sell children to monsters. They're garbage, and garbage gets burned. Grant nodded, looking past his men and toward the grand staircase. Within 48 hours of Aria's midnight knock, 47 heavily armed, hardened men from the most dangerous syndicates in America would descend on Chicago. They were coming not for money, not for a power grab, and not for territory. They were coming for a 7-year-old girl in a yellow dress who had braved a thunderstorm to protect her baby sister. They were coming to enforce the undeniable truth that some lines should never, ever be crossed. The sound of tires crushing the gravel driveway made Victor look up from his encrypted tablets. A pristine, classic black Cadillac rolled toward the massive gates of the Torino estate. From his unmoving post at the top of the grand staircase, Bruno's deep voice carried down into the war room. "Who called her?" the giant asked, a rare note of apprehension in his tone. Grant Torino didn't even look up from the sprawling blueprints spread across the mahogany table. "Nobody needs to call her," the underworld boss said quietly. "She always knows." The heavy front doors swung open before the perimeter guards could even reach for the handles. Elena Torino stepped inside the foyer like an absolute force of nature. She was 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back severely into a neat bun and eyes as sharp as cut glass. Though she stood barely 5 feet tall, she moved with an unyielding, magnetic authority that forced men twice her size to immediately step aside. Wearing a simple black dress, pearl earrings, and a gold cross resting against her collarbone, she looked the part of a sweet, unassuming grandmother. In reality, she was anything but. "Where are the girls?" Elena demanded, offering not a single greeting or question about the storm. Grant rose from his leather chair. "Mama, they're sleeping," he cautioned. Elena waved her hand dismissively, silencing the most feared man in Chicago. "I'm not going to wake them," she stated, her commanding voice softening just a fraction. I need to see them." She marched past her lethal son, past Victor and the heavily armed capos, and ascended the stairs with a cadence that brooked absolutely no argument. Bruno saw her coming and immediately stood at attention, sliding his heavy wooden chair aside without uttering a single word. Even the syndicate's most brutal enforcer knew better than to stand in Elena Torino's way. Elena stopped at the doorway of the secure suite and went entirely still. Aria lay in the center of the plush mattress, her newborn sister tucked safely against her side, both breathing peacefully in the dim ambient light. The older woman's hand rose slowly, pressing firmly against her heart. Her sharp eyes glistened with unshed emotion, but she refused to let a tear fall. Then Elena turned abruptly, the fierce matriarch returning instantly. "Those children need real food." She marched downstairs and straight into the estate's industrial kitchen, surveying the chaotic mess of empty milk bottles, discarded breadcrumbs, and half-empty coffee cups from the night before. "Out! All of you out!" she ordered, banishing the hardened criminals from her presence. Within minutes, the kitchen was entirely Elena's domain. Heavy pots clanged against the commercial stoves, and the rich, healing aroma of homemade chicken broth and fresh herbs began to fill the cold, sprawling mansion. Upstairs, the warm, savory smell reached Aria's dreams. It was a scent that spoke of safety, something that reminded her of a distant time before her uncle's house became a prison. Aria's eyes fluttered open, and she sat up quickly, a sharp panic rising in her chest. This wasn't her barren room. These weren't her thin sheets. Her small hand shot out frantically, finding the baby beside her, still sleeping, still breathing. A wave of profound relief flooded through her. Then she saw the woman standing in the doorway. Alina held a steaming porcelain bowl in her hands, her face framed by silver hair. Aria scrambled backward against the ornate headboard, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. It was a strange house, filled with strange people, and now a strange woman was approaching her. But Alina didn't approach quickly. She moved with slow, deliberate grace, like a handler approaching a deeply frightened animal. She set the bowl gently on the nightstand and knelt directly beside the mattress, so she was well below the terrified girl's eye level. "I'm Alina," she said, her voice soft and gentle, entirely devoid of the commanding tone she used to bend the men downstairs to her will. "I'm not going to hurt you, little one. I just brought you something to eat." Aria stared at her intently, her wide eyes searching every line of the older woman's face, looking desperately for the lie, looking for the hidden threat. She found neither. Alina didn't push or insist. She simply stayed kneeling on the floor, waiting patiently. "Eat when you're ready," she whispered. "I'll be right here." In that quiet moment, something heavy and calcified broke inside Aria. For her entire life, she had been forced to be the strong one, knowing that no one else would step in to keep her sister safe. She had carried that suffocating, terrifying weight every single day. And now, this powerful stranger was looking at her like she actually mattered, offering nothing but warm soup and unconditional kindness. Aria's face crumbled completely. The tears came, but not the quiet, hidden crying she had practiced in the dark of her uncle's house. These were deep, shaking, uncontrollable sobs. Years of terror, grief, and crushing loneliness poured out of the 7-year-old girl. Alina immediately moved onto the bed, wrapping her arms around Aria and pulling the weeping child tightly against her chest. "SHH, it's okay," she murmured, rocking her gently and stroking the girl's damp blonde hair. "Let the child cry. You don't have to be strong anymore. You're safe here." Alina kissed the top of her head, her voice barely a whisper. "You're allowed to be a child now." Out in the dimly lit hallway, Grant stood perfectly still, watching through the crack in the door. He remembered being shattered and broken decades ago, utterly convinced the world had ended. And his mother had held him in that exact same way. His chest tightened, and his steel-gray eyes burned. He turned away and walked back down into the shadows, knowing Alina was providing the exact armor Aria would need to survive the war that was coming. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the piercing wail of sirens shattered the tense, insulated quiet surrounding the Torino estate. A fleet of 10 police cruisers rolled aggressively up the long gravel driveway, their flashing red and blue lights painting the mansion's imposing stone facade. Leading the charge was Detective Ray Hoffman, stepping out of his unmarked vehicle with a smug, calculated smirk and a folded piece of paper gripped tightly in his hand. He had spent the morning fast-tracking a kidnapping report filed by the uncle, framing Grant Torino as the monster who had forcefully abducted his lawful property. Hoffman was confident. He had the corrupt weight of the system backing him, and he was more than ready to drag the 2 girls back into the shadows to satisfy the broker's demands. If you're sick of a broken system that protects the bullies instead of the victims, subscribe now and comment, "No more victims." Hoffman marched up the sprawling front steps, fully expecting to face down the mountain of muscle that was Bruno, or perhaps a solid wall of armed syndicate enforcers. Instead, before the detective could even raise his fist to pound on the heavy oak, the door swung smoothly open. Victor stepped out onto the porch. The Yale-educated mastermind was the absolute picture of chilling, flawless composure. His tailored suit was perfectly pressed. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the harsh afternoon sun, and he held a slim leather briefcase loosely at his side. "Gentlemen," Victor said, his voice as smooth and unyielding as polished silk. "I am legal counsel for Mr. Torino. How can I help you?" Hoffman sneered, thrusting the court order aggressively toward Victor's chest. "We have a warrant to search these premises for 2 abducted minors," the detective growled. "Step aside, counselor." Victor didn't even blink. He took the document with 2 fingers, adjusted his glasses, and read it with agonizing, deliberate slowness. His dead calm eyes tracked across every line, every official stamp, and finally settled on the signature at the very bottom. A razor-thin smile touched his lips. "This warrant is signed by Judge Harold Morrison," Victor noted mildly. "So," Hoffman snapped, his patience fraying. "So, unfortunately, Judge Morrison has a severe conflict of interest in any matter involving my client," Victor explained smoothly. "He is currently under active federal investigation for corruption. Specifically, for accepting substantial bribes in exchange for rubber-stamping favorable rulings and warrants exactly like this one." Hoffman's smirk faltered, a flash of genuine, cold unease crossing his features. Victor neatly folded the paper in half. "This document is invalid. Any search your officers conduct under its authority would be entirely illegal, and any evidence you claim to find would be instantly inadmissible in any court in the state." He held the folded paper out, forcing the detective to take it back. "I strongly suggest you try your luck with a different judge." Hoffman's face flushed a dark, furious red. He stepped uncomfortably close to Victor, entirely dropping the facade of the righteous officer. "Don't play games with me," Hoffman hissed, his voice dropping to a low, vicious threat. "We'll be back with a bulletproof warrant, and when we are, Torino is going down. You're all going down." Victor didn't retreat a single inch. He simply tilted his head, his calm gaze locking onto the corrupt detective. "I look forward to it, Detective Hoffman," Victor replied. He paused, letting the silence stretch before adding, almost as a casual afterthought, "And while you're at the courthouse, you might want to carefully review your own offshore financial records. I hear the FBI has been asking very pointed questions about certain regular, large deposits in your accounts. Amounts that perfectly match payments from the broker's front companies." Hoffman went deathly pale. The blood completely drained from his face as the realization hit him like a physical blow. The Torino syndicate didn't just know about the uncle, they knew everything. They had the ledger. "Just something to consider," Victor smiled pleasantly. The detective stood frozen for a long, humiliating moment, staring at the closed doors of the Torino estate. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and signaled his men. The 10 police cruisers pulled away in a screech of tires, rapidly retreating from the fortress they had thought would be easy prey. Inside the grand foyer, Victor turned back to find Grant Torino waiting in the shadows of the marble hallway. "How long do we have?" Grant asked, his voice a low, echoing rumble. "They'll find a clean judge eventually, someone they haven't completely compromised," Victor answered, his smooth facade giving way to strict, urgent business. "Maybe 48 hours, maybe less. We need to move faster." Grant nodded slowly, his mind already calculating the next brutal steps in the war. Victor had the financial records, the intercepted communications, and the unassailable proof of the trafficking ring. But Grant knew that to make this stick, to ensure the uncle was locked away in a concrete cell where he could never touch Aria or her sister again, they needed the one piece of evidence the corrupt system could not ignore or bury. They needed the little girl in the yellow dress to speak. The night before the hearing, the sprawling Torino estate felt heavier than usual. Aria sat perfectly still on the edge of the plush mattress in the secure suite, her newborn sister curled peacefully against her side. The soft glow of a small lamp cast long, stretching shadows across the walls, but Aria's eyes were fixed on the darkened window. Tomorrow, she would have to walk into a sprawling courtroom. Tomorrow, she would have to look directly at the uncle who had treated them like cargo and say out loud what he had done to them. Her stomach churned violently at the thought, a cold dread wrapping tightly around her small ribs. A soft, respectful knock broke the heavy silence. The thick oak door creaked open, and Grant Torino stepped inside. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that belied his massive, intimidating presence. His tailored suit jacket was gone, his collar open, revealing the stark, dark ink creeping up his neck. He pulled a heavy wooden chair from the corner and sat down directly beside the bed, ensuring he remained at her eye level. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You don't have to do this, Arya," Grant finally said, his deep voice carrying a rare, raw gentleness. She looked at him, her wide eyes searching his face. "Victor has the ledger. He has the bank statements, the intercepted calls, and the offshore accounts," Grant explained, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We have enough to build a cage for him. You don't have to see him again. You don't have to face him. Nobody in this house would ever blame you if you stayed right here." Arya was silent for a long time. She looked down at her sleeping sister, at the fragile, perfect face of the infant who had no voice of her own. She thought of the cold, damp holding locations her uncle had mentioned on his hushed phone calls, places where other children were kept in the dark. "How many other kids does the broker have?" Arya asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Grant hesitated. He could have lied to her, told her everything would be fine, and let her carry on as a child should. But the girl in the yellow dress had earned the absolute truth. "We don't know for certain," he answered, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "Maybe a dozen, maybe more." "If I don't talk, will they be saved?" she asked. "It's harder without your testimony," Grant admitted, his voice thick. "Much harder." Arya nodded slowly, her small hands clenching into tight, trembling fists on her lap. "Then I have to do it," she stated, her voice steadying with a certainty that defied her 7 years. "When we were locked in that house, I used to hear him making deals. I promised myself I would never let anyone hurt my sister again." She looked up at the underworld boss, her expression fierce and unbroken. "If there are other kids like her, kids who are scared and waiting for someone to open the door, I have to try." Grant stared at this child, absolutely astounded by the towering bravery housed in such a tiny, battered frame. He saw the ghost of his own sister, Clara, in her fierce, protective love for someone smaller and weaker. He saw the echoes of the boy he used to be, the boy who had tried to fight back against a monster and failed. "You are the bravest person I have ever met, Arya," Grant whispered, his voice catching slightly. "And I have met a lot of dangerous people." Grant reached into his pocket and pulled something out. It was a delicate silver chain, gleaming flawlessly in the lamplight. Suspended from it was a heavy, solid silver pendant shaped like a shield, engraved with the Torino family crest. It was not the cheap, broken sunburst she already wore, but a forged piece of absolute protection. "My sister Clara wore a sunburst just like yours," Grant said quietly, his thumb brushing the polished metal of the shield. "It couldn't protect her, but this is different. This is armor." He leaned forward and gently clasped the chain around Arya's neck, the silver shield resting heavily against her chest, right beside her own tarnished sunburst. "When you walk into that courtroom tomorrow, you wear this against your monster. It means you are shielded by me, by Bruno, by Victor, and by 44 other men who would tear this city apart before they let him take one step toward you." Arya reached up, her small fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, solid silver. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of fear. "I'll wear it," she promised, her voice laced with newfound steel. The heavy door opened wider, and Alina Torino stepped into the room, carrying something meticulously draped over her arm. The matriarch offered a warm, encouraging smile that completely transformed her sharp features. "If you are going to face a monster tomorrow," Alina said, her voice ringing with maternal pride and defiance, "you are going to look absolutely unbreakable doing it." She held up a brand new dress. It was a brilliant, vibrant yellow, the exact color of the soaked, ruined dress Arya had worn the night she arrived, but this one was made of fine, heavy silk, impeccably tailored and completely unstained. It was the kind of dress a little girl might wear to a celebration, a garment that screamed of life, hope, and absolute defiance. Arya touched the soft fabric, the silver shield resting securely against her heart. She was a 7-year-old girl preparing to walk into a war zone, but as she looked at Grant and Alina, she knew with absolute certainty that she would not be walking in alone. Tomorrow, the witness in the yellow dress would speak, and the empire of the broker would burn to the ground. The courtroom was enormous, with high ceilings, cold fluorescent lights, and dark wooden benches stretching back in intimidating rows. It was the kind of room specifically designed to make ordinary people feel incredibly small. Behind the elevated mahogany bench sat the presiding judge, a woman with a face carved from stone and eyes that had seen every lie and manipulation the city had to offer. She missed nothing. Below her, lawyers shuffled papers, court officers stood at rigid attention, and a stenographer's fingers hovered silently over the keys. At the defendant's table, the uncle sat in a cheap suit that didn't fit him right. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Arya walked in. She looked impossibly small, a tiny figure wrapped in vibrant, heavy yellow silk, entirely swallowed by the vastness of the legal chamber. Her shoes clicked softly against the polished marble floor, each step echoing in the dead silence. Her small hands trembled slightly at her sides, but her back was perfectly straight as she saw her uncle immediately. He was staring at her, his eyes dark pools of absolute hatred. His lips twisted into that familiar, cruel smirk, the exact same smirk he wore when he locked her in the dark, the smile that said he knew she would fail. Arya's heart pounded violently against her ribs, but her fingers found the heavy silver shield pendant resting against her chest, and she didn't look away. She walked right past his table, past his poisonous gaze, all the way to the elevated witness stand. The leather chair was too high. When she sat, her bare legs dangled above the floor, not touching anything. She felt suspended, floating in the terrifying tension of the room, but she sat up straight, pulling her shoulders back and keeping her chin level as the prosecutor approached. "Arya, can you tell us what happened the night you left your uncle's house?" the prosecutor asked gently. Arya took a deep, shaking breath and she began to speak. Her voice was quiet but crystal clear. She told them everything. How her uncle had grabbed her, calling her and her newborn sister nothing more than property. How she had hidden in the hallway and heard him on the phone, talking to the broker about clearing his massive gambling debts with special cargo. As she spoke, the uncle scoffed loudly, leaning forward with a terrifying glare, trying to intimidate her into silence. Don't let the voices of the wicked drown out the truth. Subscribe if you believe everyone deserves to be heard and respected. "There's a house," Arya recited, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I heard them talk about it on the phone. There are other children there." She turned her head, looking directly into her uncle's eyes, and his cruel smirk faltered completely. "I heard them crying through the walls." Her voice grew stronger. "He was going to sell my sister to those people. He was going to kill us." The uncle exploded. He shot to his feet, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward with a violent crash. "She's lying. That little brat is lying." His voice roared through the judicial chamber. "I'm her guardian. She's my property. I can do whatever I want with what's mine." The judge slammed her gavel down like a thunderclap. "Order! Sit down immediately," she commanded. But the uncle didn't hear her, or he simply didn't care. He pointed a shaking finger at Arya, his face twisted in unhinged rage. "You'll pay for this, you hear me? When I get out, I'll find you." 4 armed court officers rushed forward in an instant. They grabbed his arms, forced him violently back against the table, and slammed heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. He fought them, twisting and screaming about his cargo and his rights, until they dragged him roughly toward the side door. His furious screams echoed down the corridor even after the heavy door slammed shut behind him. Silence. The entire courtroom was frozen. Everyone stared at the door where the monster had disappeared, then slowly all eyes turned back to the witness stand. Arya sat completely motionless. Her face was pale, white as paper. Her small hands gripped the wooden edge of the chair so tightly her knuckles had turned bloodless, but she hadn't cried. She hadn't run, and she hadn't looked away. The stern judge removed her reading glasses, her carved expression softening just slightly. "Arya," the judge's voice was remarkably gentle. "You have shown remarkable courage today. The court thanks you for your testimony. You may step down." Arya climbed off the oversized chair, her legs feeling like water. Each step toward the center aisle took everything she had. Then she saw him. Grant Torino stood at the very back of the courtroom, just inside the heavy double doors, his steely gray eyes fixed entirely on her. His arms were open. Arya ran. For the first time in her life, she ran toward someone instead of away. Her feet flew across the marble, the vibrant yellow silk fluttering behind her like a banner of victory. Grant caught her, lifting her effortlessly into the air and holding her tightly against his broad chest. "You did it," he whispered into her hair, his own voice thick with emotion. "You were so brave." His arms tightened around her. "I'm so proud of you." Arya buried her face in his shoulder, her fingers gripping his crisp collar, and finally, she let herself shake. Grant carried her through the doors and out of the suffocating courtroom, stepping into the bright sunlight. Waiting for them on the courthouse steps stood Bruno, Victor, and the rest of the 47 men. A sprawling wall of black suits and stone faces, an impenetrable fortress of protection. They watched Grant emerge with the little girl in his arms. Nobody spoke, because nobody needed to. Arya, a 7-year-old child small enough to fit in a single man's embrace, had just done what most adults couldn't. She had stared down her monster, and she had won. Arya's brave testimony set an unstoppable avalanche in motion. Within hours of her stepping down from the witness stand, Victor, the Yale-educated mastermind with his wire-rimmed glasses, made a single encrypted phone call. A contact inside the Federal Bureau received a meticulously organized package containing the ledger, the recordings, and the offshore bank statements. By midnight, federal warrants were unequivocally signed. At dawn, a convoy of black SUVs rolled through a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, carrying tactical agents to an ordinary-looking house with white siding and a green lawn. They breached the front door and tore through the main floor before breaking the triple-locked seal of a reinforced basement door. Inside the soundproofed dark, they found what the broker had been hiding: 14 terrified children, filthy and starving, waiting to be sold. The broker himself was arrested 12 hours later, caught trying to flee toward the northern border, permanently ending his massive shadow network. Detective Ray Hoffman didn't fare any better. Agents walked directly into his precinct at noon, stripping the corrupt captain of his badge and his freedom in front of the very officers he had commanded for 20 years. But the heaviest gavel fell on the uncle. He stood before the unyielding judge and listened as the evidence, Arya's words, the financial records, and his own intercepted voice, buried him alive. He was handed 35 years in federal prison with absolutely no possibility of parole. As the guards forcefully dragged him away, he turned to look at the gallery. Arya sat there flanked by Grant Torino and Alina, her small hand resting over the heavy silver shield pendant on her chest. She didn't flinch, didn't tremble, and didn't look away. In that silent exchange, the monster finally saw the truth. The uncle thought he could break them, but he was wrong. Subscribe and comment, love always wins, to celebrate Arya's victory. Despite the overwhelming triumph, Grant Torino, a man whose dark Roman features and stark neck tattoos commanded absolute authority, knew a painful truth. He couldn't keep the girls. The Torino estate was a fortress of extreme wealth and fierce love, but it was also a nexus of danger, surrounded by bodyguards and the constant, suffocating shadow of the underworld. It was no place for a 7-year-old girl and an infant to grow up. Alina, the sharp-eyed matriarch, understood this before Grant even had to speak the words. She personally vetted a couple, old friends of the family whose own grown children had left their large, sunlit home feeling empty. Alina marched through their house unannounced, checking window locks and inspecting the nursery, finding a room already filled with picture books and a nightlight, prepared with absolute love. 1 year later, that sunlit house echoed with joyous laughter. It was Arya's 8th birthday, and the expansive backyard was completely overrun by the most dangerous men in America. 47 enforcers, fixers, and capos from New York, Boston, Miami, and Detroit had parked their sleek black cars along the quiet suburban street. Today, they weren't wearing their grim, stone-faced scowls. Today, the men in black suits were actually smiling. Arya ran across the green lawn, a vibrant blur in a bright yellow summer dress, her blonde hair flying behind her. The silver shield Grant had given her still rested securely against her collarbone, a permanent fixture over her heart. Her baby sister, now a thriving, babbling toddler, was currently being carried on the massive shoulders of Bruno. The 6'5" heavyweight enforcer had a new tattoo etched onto his scarred forearm. The baby's name, written in a child's messy scrawl, right below the ink from his violent past. Grant Torino stood near the edge of the patio, sipping a glass of iced tea, looking entirely out of place in his tailored suit among the balloons and streamers, yet perfectly at peace. When Arya spotted him, she sprinted over and crashed into his legs, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist. Grant laughed, a rare, deep sound that made Victor and the other men pause in pure astonishment, and scooped the girl up. "I have something for you," Grant murmured, setting her down gently and pulling a wrapped package from the patio table. Arya tore the paper away to reveal a custom-made, miniature leather jacket. On the back, embroidered in meticulous silver thread, were the words, "Protected by the Torino Syndicate." "You're the first person outside the bloodline to wear this," Grant told her, his steely gray eyes locking onto hers, dropping to a level of profound seriousness. The yard grew quiet as the 47 men turned to listen. "You saved yourself, Arya. You were brave enough to knock on a devil's door in the middle of a storm, and you were brave enough to tell the truth." He placed his heavily tattooed hand gently on her small shoulder. "But I want you to listen to me. You are never alone. Not tomorrow, not next year, not when you are 50 years old." Grant's voice carried over the sunlit lawn, a fierce, unbreakable vow. 47 men will come through any storm for you and your sister. Anytime, any place. No questions asked." Arya looked at the jacket, then at the sprawling crowd of giants, lawyers, and enforcers who had become her uncles, her protectors, her guardian angels waiting in the shadows. She slipped the leather jacket on over her yellow dress. It was a little too big, the sleeves hanging past her hands, but she didn't care. She looked up at the man with the face of a Roman emperor, the man who had opened his door when the rest of the world had shut theirs. She smiled, the silver shield catching the bright, warm sunlight. She finally understood what it meant to be safe.